next speaker will be Logan Pappenfort, who joined the Illinois State Museum in 2021 as a curator of anthropology at Dickson Mounds, and now serves as interim director of the Illinois State Museum. He is a citizen of the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, and from 2018 to 2021 served as second chief, an elected position in the federally recognized tribe. He earned his anthropology degree at Kansas State University and is also a member of the Illinois State Historical Society's advisory board. Today he is speaking on recovering the past, Illinois tribes, and the road to remembrance and commemoration. Please join me in welcoming Logan.
Aya Tepewenea Koke, Winsweane Logan Pappenfort. Hello everyone, it's good to see you all. My name is Logan Pappenfort. What I want to talk to you is about my people specifically, and two very important ideas. And that's remembrance and commemoration. So when we're talking about Native people, it's really important that I set the context of what we're going to be talking about in my presentation here. Remembrance, I want to go over who my people are, why that's important, what that really means when I say my people, how that's affected the state we now call Illinois, this place, and how that's affected my people beyond that removal, beyond those treaties. And then when I talk about commemoration, well, that's an interesting word because commemoration is a celebration. And so while the history that we just heard is very important, it is hard to celebrate that history. But I do have things that we can celebrate within my talk, because while that history is our history, it does not define my people. And I hope that's something you will get as we go through this journey. So for those that don't know me, I want to talk a little bit about myself. I know a little bit vain, but I think it's important for the context. So as mentioned, I am a Peoria tribal citizen. And so that means I'm a member of the federally recognized tribe, the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. And so then there's the elephant in the room of the second chief. So second chief is a elected position within the tribe. And when I became second chief in 2018, I was actually the youngest person to ever take that position, to our knowledge, in the history of our tribe. And I did so because there was a lack of new ideas within my nation. And it was one of those things that I took upon myself. I've never been one that seeks out power, leadership. I've always been someone who seeks out knowledge, just like so many people in this room do. But I find myself in these situations where, because I have knowledge, I am relied on more and more. And that is how I came upon the position of second chief. And I gladly did that duty up until I had the opportunity to expand my knowledge by coming to work with people that I had truly grown an immense amount of respect for at the Illinois State Museum. And so since 2021, I had been working in the capacity of curator of anthropology at Dickson Mounds State Museum. And then recently, I was once again given a position of what I would call power that I felt called to. And that's because I recognize that I have a unique perspective, and I think that's one reason that I'm standing before you talking today, is the perspective of a Native person, especially a Native person from Illinois, is unique. And I say that because we all saw the removal of the Peoria, and it was 1818, and so my family has been removed from Illinois for over 200 years. And so I am very privileged, the fact that I can return to my ancestral home and not only live here and educate people and talk with all you wonderful people here today, but also I get to raise my daughter in her ancestral homeland. And that's the first time that's happened in 200 years. And so this handsome gentleman behind me is George Rusher Finley, or Tewakwakwa, and he was the last hereditary chief of the Piankashaw. And he is my great-great-great-grandfather. And we are of Deer Clan. And passed down, I would traditionally inherit that role if we still practiced our ways. But we'll see as we go through why that became difficult, but why that's changing. So who are the Peoria? You know, we talk about this, and, you know, I'm a Peoria citizen from Oklahoma, but I'm talking about the Illinois tribes. So the Peoria are what we look at as a confederated tribe, and that means that essentially all those tribes with those cultural identities, which Mike very clearly outlined, we all confederated upon removal. And this isn't something that necessarily happened quickly, but it's something that we were happy to do because we already had connections with these groups. And when you talk about the Peoria, I generally like to divide them into two groups for simplicity's sake, that being the Kaskaskia and the Peoria, that being who most people think of when they think of Illinois tribes. And so the Kaskaskia, predominantly more up in the northern parts of Illinois, and the Peoria are generally, we think of our homeland, heart of our homeland in Peoria, no pun, ironically, Peoria, Illinois, which we had a large village known as Pematui. And that is one of those things that's really important to me is I live in Havana, Illinois. I live about an hour away from Peoria. And so you can imagine most times I'm going around doing types of these things, I say, oh, I'm a Peoria citizen. And my response I get a lot of times is like, oh, my mom's from Peoria. And so I always have to clarify what that means. But I'm always happy to do so, because in that moment, I'm educating someone and they're gaining a deeper knowledge about tribal people. And so this right here is one of George Catlin's depictions of a Peoria citizen. And you'll see, the one thing I always like to point out, I like to use Catlin's images because they are really iconic, because oftentimes the stereotype of teepees, headdresses are all too prevalent. And that is not the tribes of Illinois. And I was really happy to see in the previous presentation all the depictions of Black Hawk, because it is good, I feel, to see the actual images of what we look like. Although, I will say this is kind of wearing your Sunday best. And so the Piankashaw and the Wea are the next category. And so the Piankashaw are my people. And so the Piankashaw and the Wea are very closely related to the Miami. And so the Miami are a group that are predominantly in Indiana, but they share a language with my people. And so the Piankashaw were one that most recently split, and the Wea are one that split a little bit earlier, but they both share that really close cultural identity. And even today, when you go to our tribe, there's kind of like, there's the families, oh, that's a Wea family. Oh, that's a Piankashaw family. That's a Kaskaskia family. So we maintain these traditions. And so that's why it's really important, I think, to tease out these subgroups, because what the federal government essentially did is it made us kind of choose an identity. And so we're all Peoria now, but we do have these cultural differences. And even when we look at our language, Piankashaw language is slightly different from Peoria language, and Wea language is also just slightly dialectally different. And when we look at how our language is structured, how we've reassembled it today is using resources from a lot of these different tribes, which means how we speak today is not exactly how people would have spoke in the 1600s, but it gets very close to it. So I want to talk a little bit about our time in Illinois before we get to what comes after. And so as you can see, and as was very well documented in Mike's presentation, the decline of Native people and our removal. But I want to also show this map here on the right, because this gives you an idea of how occupied the Illinois River was with our villages. And so, in fact, these red triangles are actually from specific sites that are part of the Peoria Tribe Archaeological Collection, which came out of collaboration in the 90s for repatriation of ancestors as well as cultural items to tribes. And whenever I've shown this map previously, I always do get a lot of people that are like almost in awe of the concentration, because I think there's a perception from the general public, which I know better than to assume all of you all are the general public, that there's sparsely dotted tribes and villages all throughout Illinois. But no, Illinois at this point is a very populated place. And that's something that I want to stress, is that it's, and I think it has been stressed, is this was not an empty area just ripe for the taking. But you see that there's different movements throughout time. And where we started, we maintained most of that Central River area. And there are various factors that caused us to decline. And so this is something I kind of want to tease out a little bit, because we saw on Mike's map, we were in central Illinois, and then all of a sudden we were in southern Illinois. And so I think it's really important to talk about why that is. So there's obvious things like conflict with the Europeans and illness that happened to my people. But in addition to that, there's also conflict with other groups. I've been privileged in the past year to welcome both contingents of Sac and Fox as well as Iroquois people to the museum. Ironically enough, both of those groups had an effect on our population moving southward. Now, yesterday actually, we met with the Iroquois, and I, for a moment, had it was a very strange experience, because I thought to myself what my ancestors would think if I were welcoming Iroquois into our homeland with open arms. And probably wouldn't be too happy with me, but I hope they understand the context when I see them again. But we were in an intense conflict with the Iroquois during this time period, and that was due to conflict of European trade goods. Essentially, Iroquois wanted to be the sole proprietor of trading with the French, and we were very well situated to trade with the French ourselves. And so what ended up happening is Iroquois would come and raid our villages in the summers, generally when the men would be away at the bison hunts. And so eventually that, combined with other factors, is why we see that our major population moves down to the mouth of the Mississippi or the Mississippi River. And so I say that because, if you're looking at this from a removal standpoint of, as Thomas Jefferson says, we need to give us no other option, essentially, but to be removed. Who's the easiest target there in the 1800s? Well, that's definitely us. And so I don't think it is a coincidence, and it's something that I've thought about a lot, of the dates of our treaties in particular, especially the treaty with the Peorias. I mean, that's September that's happening, and then December 3rd is statehood. And so the topic of statehood is something that I've grappled with a lot, because I have many friends, many colleagues who are all Illinoisans, and I care very deeply about all of them. But at the same time, that beginning of that statehood was the end of my people's time here. And the best way I know to look at it is my goal, because that history is so often not told, I'm going to continue with the Peoria. Where usually this is where the Illinois history stops. We usually stop after this point. My tribe is gone, tribes are leaving, Black Hawk Wars happen. But let's follow the Peoria, because I think that history is important, especially in the context of a state that bears our name. So when we were removed to Missouri, it was due to our 1818 treaty. And when we moved, we didn't move very far. We moved the absolute least amount we could to still stay in the area that we loved, in our homeland. And so that's how we settled in St. Genevieve. And in fact, there are some historic sites down in southern Illinois where you can see St. Genevieve very well from the other side of the Mississippi River. And it's really is a beautiful site, and it's one that is powerful for me as a Peoria person, but also very hard, because that is the view that my ancestors must have looked at before they crossed that river for the last time. And so when we first were removed to Missouri, that is really when the consolidation of our people really started, because up until this point, the Piankashaw and the Weah and the Kaskaskia and the Peoria, we were like cousins you saw at family gatherings. You knew of them, you cared about them, but they weren't someone that was in your day-to-day life. Well, this is when that day-to-day life starts to get even closer. And I do want to specifically mention that there were a few select families that were allowed to stay in Illinois, but they had very strict guidelines about the land they were allowed to have. And it was, I do mean individual families, and usually they're families with good relations with the settlers. And so Missouri statehood comes around, and we know what happens with statehood. So Missouri was the 24th state to enter the Union in August 10th, 1821. And while Missouri was going towards that journey to statehood, there were issues that had arose from removal. And some of those issues were game was scarce, over competition for resources. But that makes a lot of sense when you think about where a lot of the nations were removed to after they were removed from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. A lot of them were told just to go west of the Mississippi. Well, that will create conflicts of not only resources, but of the tribes that are already there. And so in this time period, we had conflicts with the Osage because we were essentially in their land utilizing their resources. And so the political dynamics of our people, of the native people of this country, were thrown into disarray by this removal. And that's something I think is not often talked about, because, we have politics between tribes and the federal government and the French and the Americans, but there's also that interplay between each other and how that was affected by removal. So to solve this problem the Missouri had, there was another set of treaties that were enacted. And this treaty was with the Kaskaskias and the Peorias, as well as the Piankashaw and Weah. And this is, once again, we're being removed from our new home that was as close to our old home as possible. And this time, we have a little bit further to travel, because we are removed from Missouri all the way to what we now call Paola, Kansas. And so, as part of this treaty, the Peoria and the Kaskaskia become unified, but the Weah and the Piankashaw also become unified. So you see that we're getting closer to that total unification under the Peoria, but it happens in steps. And there is also a great deal of proximity. And so you might ask, why Kansas as the next step? Well, that's where everyone is going. So you see, here's some reservation tracts in Kansas around this time in the 1830s. You see a lot of familiar names here. You see the Osage, we see the Potawatomi, we see Miami, we see Sac and Fox, Shawnee. All of these are people that we knew and interacted with. And so this removal to Kansas was just another step in that. And you'll see that our tracks, 11 and 12, are right next to each other. So we are still interacting just as we always have with each other, with our families and our cultural units. And this is something that it's a good land. And so of the accounts that we have, the oral traditions, this was considered to be a good space, and we were happy here for a time. So we ended up settling by rivers. We definitely have a attunement to the rivers. Our origin stories, we come of the rivers, so we are people of the river. And so here, a chief by the name of Baptiste Peoria created a land. And in this land, in what we now call Paola, he created a courtyard. And in this courtyard, one of his stipulations is nothing was ever to be built in this courtyard because that was for our ceremonies. So you see, even by this point in the 1830s, we're still maintaining ceremonies through all this removal. And that is something I'm tremendously proud of. And even when Baptiste Peoria gave this land to the city of Paola, that was a stipulation he had. But as you can see from one of our citizens, A.J. Peary, there was plentiful game, and it was an environment that we were accustomed to and we were grateful for in a lot of ways, because thinking of where we came from, Missouri, where game was scarce and we were having to contend with regular flooding of the Mississippi, which is very different from flooding of the Illinois River, as anyone that's familiar with that hydrology can attest to. So this is what we consider home, and we were actually here for 37 years. So that's something that's, I think, really important to think about, because 37 years could potentially be someone's entire life that they are here. This is all they've known. But as we know, we are the Peoria Tribe Indians of Oklahoma, not the Peoria Tribe Indians of Kansas. So something did happen, and that was the Civil War. And so as a result of the Civil War, there were pressures upon us as a people. And that not only was the actual act of the war something that negatively affected us, but there were settlers that came after the war, veterans of the war, that essentially felt that they were owed land, and the land in Kansas was what was targeted by them. So there's accounts of essentially settlers breaking into native people's houses and threatening them. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs did not really do much about it at that time, so there had to be a solution. And that solution was the 1867 Omnibus Treaty. And the 1867 Omnibus Treaty was essentially the treaty that moved many tribes to Oklahoma. And at this time, my people were given a choice. They're given a choice of staying in Kansas, giving up their right as native people, becoming white essentially, or retain their native identity and be removed to Oklahoma. That is a staggeringly hard choice to make for your family if it is given to you. Do you accept the stability that comes with staying where you've always known potentially, but give up who you are as a people? Or do you take the gamble and be removed again to a place you don't know? And so a portion of us did stay. But everyone who's a citizen of the Peoria tribe today are the ones that win. Because according to our enrollment, those that stayed no longer have right to be Peoria citizens. And that's something I struggle with. I really do. Because I understand how difficult that choice, and if I was given that choice, I might have chosen to stay. If I had to choose between stability for my daughter or moving to someplace where it was unsure what would happen, especially given the history that's already happened to my people, I don't know what I'd do. But I know that my ancestors did make that choice to the uncertainty to move. And George Washington Finley, he was born during this period. His name means Trail of the Storm. He was born during a thunderstorm in Kansas, Miami County, Kansas, and moved to what we now know, or what is now Miami County, Oklahoma. And so this here is a map of our reservations as we stand today. Because thankfully, where we ended up in Oklahoma, which is also between two rivers, is where we are still to at this day. And so when we were moved here, we actually didn't even get the choice of purchasing our own tract of land. The federal government sold our land in Kansas and purchased land on our behalf from the Quapaw. So the Quapaw are right north of us, and you see that there is the Peoria, there's the Miami, there's the Ottawa, as well as the Eastern Shawnee. And so we're with people we recognize still. And this is a land that it was a lot drier than where we were in Kansas, but it was still land that we could farm and land that we still appreciate to this day. So without going too in detail about what happens then, we're going to skip ahead because throughout this entire removal, every step of this way, cultural traditions are lost. Our way is lost. However, that's not the end of it, because cultural preservation is something that's really taken off in the past, I'd say 50 years, as tribes have gotten their feet under them. They've gotten the funding. They've gotten the ability to do something about preserving these practices. And so cultural preservation works in a couple ways. And by virtue of how the world works today, a lot of it happens through the regulatory process. A lot happens through laws such as NAGPRA and National Historic Preservation Act. In fact, I mentioned earlier the consultation for NAGPRA that happened in the 90s. That was one way that we learned a lot about our people. And so one of our elders, when I was going up to work for Illinois State Museum, she told me, they know everything about us on the east side of the Mississippi, but we know about us on the west side. So, and I'm fairly confident she also said a similar thing back in those 90s consultation, which she was a part of. And she was ecstatic for me to come up here because we've had such good relationships with the institutions that are here today. But cultural preservation is what kind of is the vehicle that allows us for me to be standing here in front of you today. If cultural preservation didn't exist, I would probably have not even been here. I might be working as a shovel bum somewhere on a roads project. Me being native, having no relevance, still being myself, I probably would have still pursued archaeology because that's just who I am. But cultural preservation is really important because it gives us that interface to work with other institutions. Most of my friends and colleagues that I have today are out of direct result of consultations I've had. Now, that probably says a lot about me and my work-life balance, but it's also important because it builds these relationships. And so historic preservation and NAGPRA are really, really critical to that whole process, because we talk a lot about NAGPRA in our day-to-day jobs at the museum, because it's really critical that we return cultural items and ancestors that need to go back to where they came from. But also, it allows us to do really cool things. It allows us to access forms of knowledge that we otherwise wouldn't necessarily have access to. Because tribes have an immense amount of knowledge. Now they have knowledge in archaeological interpretation, but also they have other forms of knowledge that we can utilize as researchers. So some of those forms include oral traditions of all kinds. So storytelling, art traditions, ecological knowledge, language, as well as our just general history, essentially the journey that we just went on leaving Illinois. So one example is when I was doing cultural preservation work, when I worked for the tribe, is I had to be well versed in the exact routes that we traveled on, because if I was looking at a site in Missouri, I had to know when we were going through that area and whether this was an Osage site or this could potentially be one of our sites as we were traveling, and what level of interest we might have.